This is our fourth discussion, right at Kiev's Independence Square. In the previous episodes, we mainly talked about freedom and threats for freedom in Ukraine and other countries, and in this one, we will focus more on the economy. But before we start, let me introduce our guests, the Vice Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration of Ukraine, Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze. This is a very interesting topic because we, the Central and Eastern European countries, have already gone through the integration process. And in our countries, we had the prospects that after the fall of the communist regime, we could finally become a part of the West. That desire was really strong, and we were ready to sacrifice many things. We worked on reforms and wanted to keep this direction. Now, 4 years after the Maidan events, do you, as a Vice Prime Minister for European integration, think the situation is similar? Is the desire of Ukraine to become a part of European structures as strong as it was for us? Well, first of all, Ukrainians are probably the only nation that proved its ability to protect real European values at the expense of their own lives. I think that such uplift, such readiness to sacrifice, has never been needed in any other country of Central and Eastern Europe. Of course, it's sad for us that this readiness and interest in the movement towards European standards, European rules, and European way of life has no clear perspective of membership that will be guaranteed by our partners from the EU or NATO. And unfortunately, many tasks we have to do on our own, and, of course, it makes the way we took more complicated for us. But at the same time, we are obviously thankful for that political support, for the technical and financial support that we now have from the European countries. But I cannot say that it's the same full-scale level of support and readiness of Europe to welcome new members as it was when Slovakia or Poland or Hungary or the Baltic countries wanted to become the members. Now, Europe is in another situation, unfortunately, meaning Europe is trying to reinvent and find itself. But I think that we have a lot in common in terms of the challenges we face and necessity to find the response to those challenges. The possibility that we, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, could join the EU and NATO was very realistic for us at that time, and this opportunity made it possible for us to deal with various regimes, like the one of Vladimir Mečiar in Slovakia, because the prospects were tangible. It was not like it may happen in 30 years. It was very realistic and possible to reach. But somehow, in Ukraine, it seems slightly different. The prospects seem to be somewhere in a mist. It is not that close. Aren't the Ukrainian politicians and citizens demotivated by all these changes which have to be conducted? You know, first of all, I think that we set a goal for us to build European rules of life and European standards of life here in Ukraine. This is what we see works in the countries that joined the European Union 10, 15 or 20 years ago. Which went through the similar processes. But of course, there is a big temptation among politicians, some populistic politicians, to say, well, you see, nobody is waiting for you in Europe, so let's count on some other forces. And, of course, It makes the discussion more complicated. It makes the process of decision-making more complicated. From my side, I always call upon our politicians to try to leave the topic of European and Euro-Atlantic integration out of tactical political struggle.
І мені здається, це би було відповідально до своїх громадян.
I think this would be fair to our nation, Ukrainian citizens, because the Ukrainian people gave us the mandate to move towards Europe. But at the same time, I understand that many people are blinded by the short-term victory in the electoral cycle, and for them, it's more difficult to see more state-related things with long-term perspective.
Звичайно, це складніше, коли в тебе немає чіткої перспективи. Разом з тим,
Of course, it's more difficult when you don't have a clear perspective. At the same time, those sacrifices made here during the Maidan, and it happened right here, people were dying under the flag of the European Union. Not a single other nation had such a harsh and such a sincere experience the Ukrainians had. And those sacrifices that we pay now fighting with Russia in the Ukrainian territory after they attacked eastern Ukraine and Crimea, all of that leave us no option but to continue moving towards Europe. But, of course, there are some forces that try to resist it, and it slows down the pace of this process and makes the decision-making process more complicated as well. When our countries strive to accede to the EU, they were certain criteria connected with the banking sector and many other aspects. What are the criteria for Ukraine, and which of them are the toughest ones? Ukraine has the most ambitious and extensive association agreement and free trade agreement with the EU out of all the agreements that the EU has ever had with any other third country. So, the main roadmaps, the main criteria that we have to fulfill to become closer to the EU are included in the agreement. The agreement gives us a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of work has to be done in different areas. When we start reforming certain sectors, we should understand that some of them haven't been reformed for 24 to 25 years since the Soviet time, for 24 to 25 years until we started implementation of the agreement. And for many people, it was convenient to live like that. When there was no transparency, when rules were not clear to everyone. And now, when we start replacing these rules by clear and transparent, they appear people who have their own interests, who do not appreciate such transparency and change in the rules of the game. And this is complicated. Regarding what is most complicated, it will be even difficult to say for me, because in every area there are difficulties, starting from the energy sector, in which we have managed to do a lot already. We were able to move forward quite seriously in the issue of energy efficiency, to transport and transport security of automobile, railway transport, water transport, etc. So all the areas of life, food production and food safety, consumer protection, all the areas are horizontally very serious and comprehensive, cover different interests and opportunities. At the same time, we see that in areas where we are able to make some progress in the agreement implementation, people start using the opportunities the agreement provides. We significantly increased our export to the EU countries. 3 or 4 years ago, we could not imagine that Europe would become our main trade partner.
Сьогодні в нас більше 41% нашого товарообороту
Now,
він якраз
the EU countries account for more than 41% of Ukraine's trade turnover. Only during the last 2017 year, this figure increased by 20%. I mean, the import-export operations within the European Union. And this means that more Ukrainians start export-oriented businesses in compliance with the European rules for quality, for business processes. And this means that they are creating a different culture around them as well, which helps others to join the new opportunities.
Яка допомагає і іншим долучитися до нових можливостей.
We have talked to various people. Many of them say there has been a lot of progress in many areas of Ukraine, but all of them complain that very little has been achieved in terms of fighting corruption. Is it that difficult?
Ну, як ми бачимо, якби воно не було складно, то напевно
Well,
більше досягли.
as we see, if it wasn't so difficult, we probably would have achieved more. But we have to understand that fighting corruption includes two main components, in my opinion. First, investigation of the crimes which will result in court decisions and imprisonment of those who are involved in corruption. This is one direction. And in this direction, we did a lot from the point of view of creating anti-corruption institutions responsible for prevention and for investigation of the corruption crimes. And I hope we will also have now the decision on the anti-corruption court, which will complete all this cycle of the very important institutions for fighting corruption effectively. But the anti-corruption struggle is not only the imprisonment of the criminals.
Але антикорупційна боротьба – це не тільки ув'язнення злочинців.
It also means necessity and continuous work to destroy the possibilities for corruption that we have had. As a government, we focus on deregulating our procedures, because in the regulations, some of which have been in force since the Soviet time, there are so many opportunities for corruption on certification, licensing, which give officials opportunity to demand some bribes from citizens or businesses.
Для чиновника можливість вимагати якісь кошти від громадян чи від бізнесів.
At the same time, we managed to become transparent. I think Ukraine is probably now the most transparent country in terms of access to all the registries, private ownership, the financial beneficiaries of the legal entities registry, and it means that information is publicly available in Ukraine. And so people can monitor it. The journalists can monitor it. The civil organizations can monitor it. So this provides additional opportunity to monitor the situation.
Систему державних закупівель, наприклад. Ми її зробили прозорою.
We've also completely changed the procurement system. We've made it transparent, electronic, clear, and this way we were able to save hundreds of millions of dollars for the budget within the last 1 year and a half or 2 years, when the system became obligatory for everyone.
З очисткою системи банківською ми закрили 50%.
The same with the gas price. The same with the cleaning of the banking system. We closed 50% of the banks that existed in Ukraine. This means that 50% of the banks worked as money laundering machines. Those were not real banks. And now we have a much stronger financial and banking system. And we see how it all results in strengthening the macroeconomic and macro-financial situation. And our task is to ensure prosperity for the nation. So both the government and the parliament, we try to work together to break corruption schemes, which have existed in Ukraine for decades.
Унеможливлювати корупційні схеми, які працювали протягом десятиліть в Україні.
4 years ago, Ukraine fought for its dignity, but the country inherited economy in a terrible condition. Then, the war with Russia started. You have very tough challenges, much more difficult ones than those we had in the 1990s, and taking into account that there are difficult tasks in front of you, you probably need some help. I think this also applies to countries, not just individuals. Do you think the help we are offering, not just in financial terms, as the EU and NATO, is actually making your situation easier?
По-перше, ми безумовно надзвичайно вдячні за ту
First of all,
підтримку, яку
of course, we are very grateful for the political support that we receive from the unity of actions of both the EU and transatlantic unity that helps Ukraine to stand on that military front line that we stand on right now, losing lives of our soldiers, of our civilians every day, suffering from the attacks of the Russian army on our territory and of those whom they provided with the weapons and whom they train and coordinate in the territories we don't currently control. At the same time, obviously, I wouldn't like to have the situation when every 6 months we have to discuss whether we need to continue the sanctions against the Russian Federation or not, when we see that the Russian Federation does not demonstrate in any way its readiness to leave the territory of Ukraine, to take away its troops, and give Ukraine opportunity to finally focus on its development and ensuring prosperity for people. So it's sad for me when such discussions happen again and again at different levels in different European capitals, as it kind of calls into question the issue of values. We believe in the values we die for, and we know that now we are the stronghold for the Western civilization here in our territory, and because of that, we lost over 10,000 Ukrainian lives. Over 23,000 people were injured, and we take care of them. We have over 1,600,000 internally displaced people who didn't join the migrants asking for shelter in Europe. They are here in Ukraine thanks to Ukrainian citizens who help each other. The state takes care of them. Obviously, we need support in order to support somehow these people. But do we have to constantly prove that we are really worth it? I think it's a black and white world if it happens like this. When it's clear that Russia brutally violated the international law. In the 21st century, without any punishment, it entered the territory of another country, to which it guaranteed the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence through the Budapest Memorandum and a great number of international agreements, a comprehensive bilateral agreement on friendship and strategic partnership. As a result, Russia violated all of it. Then, why every time we have this question whether to continue this or not, Russia only understands the language of force and unity. And until we are united in this counteraction, until that time we have a chance to make Russia get back to respecting international law. As soon as Russia manages to destroy the unity, then, unfortunately, it won't be only Ukraine under threat. All Europe and the whole Western civilization will be under threat. And the last question, a brief one. As Vice Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine, do you think that the two of us will live to see Ukraine as a member of the EU and NATO? I'm convinced that the years of our life will be enough to see that. I don't know if this will happen during my time in office. I don't think so. But I think that we will certainly get the perspective because Europe will finally understand that Ukraine will only strengthen Europe, in the same way that Ukraine is now strengthening the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as it helps to ensure safety and security of the NATO member countries. I'm an optimist, so I believe in that, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to do my work.
Дякую.
I found myself in an interesting situation. We're in Ukraine, at Kiev's Independence Square, a place that is quite notable in Ukrainian history of freedom. And I'm sitting here with two people I talked to years ago when we discussed freedom in Slovakia and Hungary. And these people have become famous as reformers in those respective eras. One of them is the author of the well-known Bokros package, and the other one is famous for making Slovakia a sort of Central European economic tiger at that time. Let me welcome our guests, Leos Bokros and Ivan Miklos. As we are sitting at Maidan Square, the Independence Square, what comes to your mind about the Maidan events when you are here?
Nagyon sokszor voltam Kijevben, már a rendszerváltás előtt.
I've been to Kiev many times, and also before the regime changed. The Soviet countries lost a lot of time after the collapse of the regime. Ukraine is not an exception.
Ebben az időszakban én a Világbankban dolgoztam.
In that period, I was working at the World Bank, and we were trying to convince the different governments that without reforms, there will never be an economic development.
Ez nem nagyon sikerült a kezdetek kezdetén.
This wasn't successful at the beginning until President Yushchenko came into office. And then I visited Ukraine on many occasions as a member of World Bank and IMF delegations.
És a Világbank delegációjaként.
And we tried to keep in touch with all the political parties and organizations in order to achieve some sort of national consensus for Ukraine to be able to realize the importance of the fundamental reforms.
Annak érdekében, hogy az alapvető reformokat Ukrajna megvalósítsa.
We know what the situation today is like. Some reforms haven't been conducted until now. That is what comes to mind concerning Maidan Square. But, of course, the political events, the protests, the human casualties are not to be ignored.
És az emberáldozatok nem mellékesek.
It is interesting to ask an economist what he thinks about the Maidan and his opinion on the idea of missing economic reforms. What about you, Ivan? I visited Ukraine in 1996, and I was also here right after the Maidan. February the 24th was the key day of the Maidan events, and I arrived early in March. It was incredibly strong and very emotional. Everything was ruined. There were barricades and tents, and there were also many flowers around here, together with photos of people who were killed. So, for me, the Maidan is a very strong emotional experience. And it is important not just for me and Ukraine, but also for the whole European Union. People were dying for European values and under the European flag. And there were so many innocent people, hundreds of innocent people, who came to a peaceful demonstration, who protested against the pro-Russian orientation of Yanukovych and stood for the European future. So this is the key idea when you mention the word Maidan. And for this reason, I am very angry when I hear those interpretations of these events as an overturn. Even in Slovakia, people use the word Maidanization, and they use it as a negative term, which is simply absurd, because on those days, the Ukrainians stood up for the values that we share. I have been active here for some time, and now I can see that the Ukrainians, Poles and Slovaks do not have big differences in their values or education. They share the same wishes and dreams of normal lives. But unfortunately, because of those things Leos mentioned, the fact they were 20 years without reforms, and there was also a lot of bribery and oligarchy, Ukraine's potential as a country, which is greater than that of our country, this big potential was not even fulfilled. Unfortunately, people's living conditions are much worse than those in our country. So that's why these reforms Leos talked about are so important. The Maidan made it possible for the first time, and so it is really significant. First time in those 4 years since Maidan, the system has been changing in terms of the free market economy. There are changes which are really difficult, which are happening very slowly. But for the first time, there is a real systematic change, thanks to the Maidan. I will go back to the overturn that was mentioned. Russia actually calls it a fascist overturn and claims it was illegitimate. They see it as a coup. But I don't understand why this happens in Slovakia or the Czech Republic or Hungary or Poland. Why is Maidanization mentioned as something negative, as an overturn carried out by extremist forces? And there is this image being built that something violent happened in Ukraine, and that's it. Whenever I come here and talk to people like Mustafa Nayan, who was here a while ago, and other people who participated in the Maidan, they call it the revolution of dignity. Those are the words they choose. They say, we understood that we, the Ukrainian nation, need to fight for freedom. It's completely different from the story we hear in our local countries. So these are European values. And now the question is, where does it come from? In the case of Moscow, I can understand it. But why is there such an opinion in our countries? Why do we believe in such stupid things? It is enough if you just come here once. You do not have to repeat it 100 times. It is because people are not well informed. You don't even have to come here personally, but you are right. There is this Russian propaganda that is very efficient. But it is not just about the Russian propaganda. It is also about the mindset of people who can easily fall for propaganda. They tend to believe in those things easily and quickly. So it's a deeper problem. But it's not a problem which exists only in Central Europe. And the contemporary situation tells us that freedom is something we need to fight for. Liberal democracy is not perfect, but is the best system we know. And unless we fight for it, which also means fighting extremism, populism, and demagoguery, freedom will not just live on by itself. There is a need to support it. There are many enemy forces. The world is changing, and people are afraid of changes. And that's what populists make use of. They benefit from people's fear and negative emotions. Because this is much easier than fighting for something positive. But the point is that not just common people say this, but also people who were involved in important economic reforms. For example, Václav Klaus and Vlado Polkov. Those are the people who fought for the same things in other countries. It doesn't really surprise me with Václav Klaus. That's been a long-term problem. But with Polko, I am really surprised, and I won't respond to this recent statement. Because he is an educated person, someone I respected. But it is true he mentions the Maidan as an overturn, and this is something I cannot understand. And it is really dangerous if these people fall for such myths. This narration, the story of a fascist overturn in Ukraine, is it also popular in Hungary?
Nem ebben a formában. Magyarországon is
Not in this form.
erős a kormánypropaganda, ami a nacionalizmust és a populizmust
There is also very strong government propaganda in Hungary as far as nationalism and populism are concerned. But in this context, I'd emphasize nationalism.
Uralkodóvá válik egy kormány politikájában.
If nationalism becomes prominent in the policies of a government, then by necessity, they see similar processes in other nations as
A
hostile.
jelenlegi magyar kormány rendkívül közel áll az orosz kormányhoz.
The current Hungarian government has very close ties with the Russian government.
Mert Orbán kormánya lényegében az orosz
This fact should not be ignored, because Orbán's government is essentially continuing the Russian policy of loosening and disrupting the unity of the European Union with their dissident politics.
folytat a legtöbb esetben, és miután Oroszország
And since Russia is basically at war with Ukraine, Viktor Orbán cannot be a friend of today's Ukraine.
lehet a jelenlegi Ukrajna barátja. Ez nagyon fontos.
It's very important to understand this.
Nemzetközi összefüggés
International correlations that are based on nationalism override even the things that would connect us.
adott esetben még azt is, ami összekötne bennünket.
There was something surprising in one of our previous discussions. There was a Hungarian guest who said that the way Hungarian society is developing these days is more inspired by Moscow than by the West, which sounds incredible. How can a member country of the European Union build society inspired by
A
Russia?
társadalom és a kormány nem ugyanaz.
Now, a question for both of you. Let's take a look at the Ukrainian economy and what Ukraine has to do to meet expectations for joining the EU. But first, let's look at visions and challenges we had. What did you inherit when you became responsible for economy in your respective countries? Do you think your task was easier than those of Ukraine?
Sokkal könnyebb volt, mint Ukrajnában. Ugyanis a
Much
reformokat
easier than in
legalábbis mi
Ukraine,
Magyarországon nagyon
because
korán
at least in Hungary, we launched the reforms very early on.
az, hogy milyenek a kiinduló
The
feltételek.
initial conditions also matter.
Magyarországnak
Already during the communist regime, Hungary managed to introduce a sort of marketized planned economy.
piacosított tervgazdaságot
Based on the results of this, the first two governments, after the regime change, carried on these reforms gradually but steadily.
kormány legalábbis erőteljesen
I'm not saying there was no resistance against this in Hungary, but disillusionment wasn't so deep yet in that period as it is now.
Ezzel szemben ellenállás, de nem volt olyan
In the
mértékű
current
kiábrándultság
Hungarian conditions,
abban az
it is
időszakban,
not new
még
reforms that are being made,
most uralkodó,
but previous reforms
olyan
are being
körülmények között,
reverted.
amikor Magyarországon jelen pillanatban nem reformokat
As soon as we have
hanem a
another
korábbi
turn, if you will, in the
visszafordítják.
future, the second act of the regime change can begin.
Ha majd lesz egy újabb fordulat, akkor, ha úgy tetszik, kezdhetjük
The
a
current
második
government
felvonását
is even
a
reverting
rendszerváltásnak.
privatization.
A
The
jelenlegi
state is
kormány
buying up
ugyanis
property,
még a
monopolizing.
privatizációt is visszafordított.
They are turning their guns into foreign capital.
Államosít, monopóliumokat épít,
making regulations that are basically deadlocking the economy, which allows people close to the current government to prevail. Nepotism, in a word.
Szabályokkal köti gúzsba a gazdaságot, ami csak azokat engedi érvényesíteni.
So the current government is anti-capitalist, anti-competition, anti-capital, and anti-investment.
Kapitalizmus ellenes, versenyellenes, tőkeellenes.
Now, this is a very difficult situation, but 23 years ago, it was much easier because today's wave of nationalization and populism didn't exist yet. And it was easier to prove to the society that if these reforms are consistently carried out, then we could get closer to EU membership. And through this membership to catching up and convergence. Could you please remind us in a couple of sentences what the Bokros package was about? Well, not in 2 sentences, because it had 156 points, but if you allow, I would outline 4 points. The first point was a change in monetary policy. We introduced a pre-announced crawling peg type of mini devaluations.
Előre bejelentett mértékekkel operáló csúszó leértékelő árfolyam politikát. Shall I say it in English?
Yeah.
Okay. The first point was the change in monetary policy. We have changed the monetary policy into a pre-announced crawling peg type of mini devaluations, which created trust and confidence in society and among entrepreneurs, so that they knew what costs will they incur in the future, and hence investments and cost calculations became predictable. Number 2 was fiscal policy changes. We implemented a few quick reforms, a so-called import surcharge, in order to enhance fiscal revenues very quickly, because we should not forget that at that time Hungary was on the verge of fiscal collapse, and it would have been very difficult to get out of an open default and crisis. The third point was the reduction of real wages and salaries in Hungary. Within 1 year, we achieved, on average, an 11% reduction of real wages and a 16% real wage decline in the public sector. That was very tough. But through that, together with the devaluation, of course, we have regained what we could call the competitiveness, international competitiveness of Hungarian labor. And the last point was some structural reforms. Some very important ones. I don't have time to enumerate all of them, but just for the sake of brevity, I was the first Minister of Finance in the whole region who introduced the tuition fee in higher education, and I am still proud of that.
We have now refreshed our memories of the difficult role that Lajos Bokros had at the time when Hungary got on the path of privatized economy. He says it was not that tough, but it certainly was not easy. I remember especially the reduction of wages was problematic. What about you, Ivan? What did you inherit at your time when you came in your office?
Ja myslím, že situácia
I guess the situation in Slovakia was harder than in Hungary, but easier than in Ukraine. Somewhere in between the two, I would say. Besides the macroeconomic imbalance, which was the main problem in Hungary, we had many deficiencies in infrastructure. We were isolated in both political and economic sense, and we had almost no foreign investment coming to Slovakia, while Hungary had a rather high level of investment from abroad. The level of corruption was high and state-owned banks were on the verge of collapse. The country was massively indebted. The situation was almost comparable to that in Ukraine 5 years ago. But what makes the Ukrainian situation even more difficult is the fact that what they had inherited was even worse, and Ukraine had never undergone reforms. And it had the corrupted oligarch regime much longer. Also, the period during which Ukraine had centrally planned economy was much longer than in Slovakia. Furthermore, the annexation of Crimea happened. There are aggressive military attacks in the east of Ukraine and a business war with the main business partner at that time. So, the situation was incredibly complicated for Ukraine. But, at some point, it was very similar to Slovakia of my time in office. Your proposal was not called a Miklos package, yet you introduced a package of measures too. Can you describe the main steps we took in Slovakia? I think there were basically two areas. During the first Zurinda's government, between 1999 and 2002, we had to deal with the most serious problems inherited from Mečier's government. We had to restructure and privatize banks, and we had to establish macroeconomic balance by making the state budget deficit lower. We also introduced a temporary import surcharge. There was devaluation for some time, so it was similar in a way. We also had to deal with the integration deficit, and we started negotiations about the OECD membership as the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary were already there. So those were the first 3 years when we had to cope with the pressing problems and deficiencies of the previous period. In the following years, from 2002 to 2006, we prepared a reform package which included macroeconomic stabilization. And there were structural reforms such as the tax reform, pension system reform, social system reform, labor market reform, healthcare reform, and fiscal decentralization. The only thing we planned but had failed to do was something that Lajos was so proud of, and that's introduction of university tuition. This is one thing we failed to achieve, but the reform package was implemented quite quickly, and the reforms were deep and comprehensive. In 2004, the World Bank declared Slovakia as the most reformative country in the world, which brought a lot of investment. This improved Slovakia's role significantly at that time.
To prečo Slovensko bolo nazývané v tom čase reformy.
No a teraz, keď vás počúvam, tak keď vás sa
Now I listen to this through the eyes and ears of a contemporary person, and I wonder, you said you managed to reduce wages by 10 or 15%. There was devaluation. You are proud for introducing tuition, but for someone who is not an economist and simply wants a better life, this might seem like a bad thing. As an ordinary person, a parent or a student, I might perceive this negatively. And so people can become reluctant to reforms, and then they can easily fall for populist offers. Is it possible that people in Ukraine might get reluctant to the reforms being conducted? In my opinion, the problem is that people's resistance or reluctance is always there, whether you make the reforms slowly or rapidly. Some kind of resistance is always present. Slow reforms can result in certain political costs. In this scenario, there are high costs. but the positive effects take longer to become obvious. Translated into the Ukrainian reality, the pace of growth of Ukrainian economy is about 3%, but on a global level it is 3.9%, and in many European countries it is even higher. Ukraine has the potential to grow by 6 or 7% in the long term, but it can only happen if reforms are made. Even if they're not popular, reforms are not really about the method of what one should do. We have a lot of experience and both good and bad results from numerous countries. Reforms are challenging in the political point of view. And what you need is leadership, ownership, and communication. You need leaders who can take responsibility and complete the reforms even despite unpopularity. And this can certainly be risky in terms of their own political careers. By ownership, I mean you should go for the reforms not just because the EU is pushing on you, but because you need them. Because you, as a leader, have to be convinced that you are doing the right thing, the best thing for your country. Only then can you convince people this is what they need. And this is connected with communication. You need to explain things. You need to keep talking on TV and fight against populists who abuse the existence of reforms for their own purposes. I don't mean to say Ukraine is not doing this. There are many positive changes, but it is not enough. The reforms need to be implemented faster. Looking back at the Maidan, Leoš mentioned opportunities that were not used and missing reforms. You implemented reforms in Slovakia and Hungary, and some of them were successful. Not all of them, but some were. And many of them were important. If you look at Ukraine's past 4 years, what has been achieved? Has it been a lot or a little?
Mindig lehet mondani, hogy a pohár félig tele van, vagy félig üres.
You can always say that the glass is half full or that it's half empty. Compared to what Ukraine had achieved earlier, there are a lot of significant changes that the government has managed to carry through. But to compare to what is needed and what the world demands, that global competition in which Ukraine has to hold its ground against circumstances when otherwise they are at war with Russia. So, in an especially difficult situation, there is more need for national unity to be strengthened in order to achieve the reforms that are necessary, and that make it possible for the economy to grow 5% instead of 3%. In order for convergence to be achieved instead of lagging behind, and to create the conditions for accessing the European Union sooner or later. At the same time, society should also feel positive effect of these changes, because Ivan has said accurately that there is a need for communication, there is also a need for credibility. There is a need to explain to society that carrying out these reforms is the best interest for them. It is very important this can only be realized if the fundamental issues are handled in a national unity. National unity has to be achieved, and this is a political task. It's not a kind of technocratic reform activity. This is the living reality of democracy every single day, in which a great step forward was carried out by the Maidan and the changes it caused. But you have to be aware not to return to a previous state. because, as I've mentioned, reforms can be reverted. Democracy can also be destroyed. Hungary is a perfect example of how a liberal democracy can be reversed into an authoritarian system, where there is no freedom of press any longer, where NGOs are under constant attack, and where the independence of law enforcement is practically over. These are the three things that make a liberal democracy, or the legal state, if you will, different from authoritarian regimes. Ukraine must not fall back into this situation. Even in present times, external conditions, once again, the state of war, are not very favorable for competitive development. Both of you said that Ukraine has a great potential, much bigger than it has been using, and 3% of growth is just a half of what they can show. As an advisor to Ukraine's Prime Minister, can you tell us what could have been done in those past years? What was neglected? I will start with the pros. For the first time, Ukraine has really been undergoing changes. In the last 4 years, more has been done than in the previous 20 years in terms of macro stabilization. In what sense? This applies mainly to macroeconomic balance, floating exchange rate, significant reduction of the budget deficit, price deregulation, such as gas for households. There have also been structural reforms, for example, the reform of the pension system. The first phase of the healthcare system reform has started, as well as a part of the tax administration system reform. There have been measures that decreased the rise of corruption. Out of 180 banks, 80 were closed. These were zombie banks that were just stealing money from clients. So these are the positive things that have been done. Do these things make the country more efficient? They are a prerequisite for a growing economy. Without these, there would be no growth of 3%. They were necessary, but they are not sufficient. Major weaknesses can be found in protection of owners' rights and justice. This relates to financial policy and corrupted bodies of the police. A judiciary reform was also introduced with new regulations. There is an independent investigation agency that focuses on corruption, but this area is still problematic. One of the major areas of corruption can be found in state-owned enterprises. There are more than 3,000 of them. Some of them are not even working at all, and many are a source of corruption. Privatization has seen very little progress. There is now a new law and the government is pushing on this, but it is only the beginning. There has been a partial progress on demonopolization of the energy sector, but again, the progress in this area needs to be much bigger. The land reform is required too. There are concerns about selling land. There are 7 million landowners with 4 hectares only. The government sold this land to these owners for symbolic prices 16 years ago, but it cannot be sold. So these people are owners, but in fact they cannot sell it, and they can only rent it to big enterprises. It is thus impossible to make changes on the market if their land cannot be used as an investment or as a security to get a bank loan. If there were progress in this area and all the issues I've mentioned as necessary, it would really help Ukraine. So there was zero progress in privatization and creating a land market. This means people are afraid that Ukraine could be bought by foreign capital. Is this possible? There have always been such concerns in Slovakia and Hungary, but it never actually happened. Of course, there are some foreign investors, but that does not mean they take the land away. There could also be some kind of a phase when foreigners are not allowed to buy it. It is what we had in Slovakia. Foreigners were only allowed to buy land if they founded a company in Slovakia. It could be that for a limited period, only physical persons, for example, would be allowed to buy land and only on a limited scale. This was suggested by the government, but unfortunately there was not enough support. In terms of privatization, again, there were more reasons. Firstly, there was not enough political will and support because there are influential politicians who are benefiting from the current situation. They nominate their friends and business partners to state-owned companies. Another thing is that privatization is unpopular all around the world. It can be hard to understand. In Ukraine, there was some privatization before, but it was not transparent. It was beneficial for the oligarchy, and so it got a very bad reputation. Another reason is that, unfortunately, Ukraine does not have the Ministry of Privatization, so there is no responsible body for this. So the Prime Minister, this was also a result of my work and the work of my colleagues, was asked to take over this agenda, and a new law was adopted. So now there are better conditions for it to be done. There can be electronic auctions that will make the privatization transparent, and hopefully it will work. Now we've described the situation in the countries where you worked, and we described Ukraine's achievements as well as the things to be done. 4 years after the Maidan, this is where we are, and Ukraine has various options. All the people we have talked to say that Ukraine cannot lose its freedom. I believed that with this determination, Ukraine will maintain its freedom. From your point of view, what will the Ukrainian economy look like in 4 years? Do you think the things we are talking about now will change? Or is it going to take decades for Ukraine to develop?
Nem szeretek jósolni. Nem vagyok aktív a jóslás üzletágban. Úgyhogy csak arról szeretnék inkább beszélni.
I don't like to prophesize. I'm not an active prophet. So I'd like to speak about all the things that need to be done in order for this great potential in the country to be actually used.
Valóban megvalósítani. Ivan elmondta a konkrét.
Ivan has already mentioned most of the specific reforms. But I'll return to the following argument. Both the market and the state have very important roles in creating a productive, efficient, healthy, competitive market economy in Ukraine, which could even become a model for the post-Soviet region.
Versenyző, versenyképes piacgazdaság jöjjön létre Ukrajnában.
Let us not forget about Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Central Asian republics. The elites of those countries have their eyes fixed on Kiev.
Van Grúzia, Örményország, Azerbajdzsán, a közép-ázsiai köztársaságok. Az ottani elit nézi árgus szemekkel.
Kiev could be a sort of center point from where these reforms are disseminated, as these countries are even more in need of reforms. So, as Ivan has said, hundreds of still functioning state-owned companies need to be privatized.
Tehát szükség van, ahogy Iván említette, a még meglévő...
Even though elimination, because let us not forget that in Poland, in Slovakia, in Hungary, one of the most important tools of privatization was precisely elimination.
Lengyelországban, Szlovákiában, Magyarországon magának a privatizációnak az egyik legfontosabb módszere, eszköze.
Which liberated tools and resources to be used efficiently by more efficient owners.
Eszközöket, forrásokat arra, hogy hatékonyabb tulajdonosok ugyanazokat az
It's very important that government regulations apply equally to everyone. The government should not be the one to select winners and losers.
Az állami szabályozás az mindenkire egyforma legyen.
Regulations have to be unified, transparent, and we should crack down on corruption with an iron fist.
A szabályozásnak egyformának kell lenni, áttekinthetőnek, transzparensnek, és
We need to show Ukrainian society that there are means that enable them to move forward with their own work, with their own efforts, without the need for the government's corrupt helping hand.
Saját munkából, saját erőfeszítéssel, anélkül boldogulni, hogy ehhez a
And last but not least, democracy and the liberal legal state has to be preserved, because without a liberal legal state, there is no market economy.
A demokráciát, a liberális jogállamot meg kell őrizni.
Without freedom, there is no bread.
Liberális jogállam nélkül nincs fejlett piacgazdaság. Szabadság nélkül nincs kenyér.
Existuje taký model, že keď sa v niektorých krajinách robia ťažké reformy, potrebné, ale ťažké, tak...
There is this model showing that if reforms are made in a country, sooner or later there will appear resistance and populism.
Na Slovensku sme toho boli svedkami v podobe Mečiara a teraz Fica.
Thus, there is this cycle which included Mečiar in Slovakia and later Fico. When I talked to Ukrainian people a year or two ago, they said that if the government was not making progress, there would be a civic pressure, and if it still doesn't help, there would have to be a new and better government. You are part of it, Ivan. So what is the development?
Neviem, či to platí, pred rokom dvoma to takto hovorili. Ivan, ty si priamo pri tom, tak ako sa to vyvíja?
No, prognozovať je ťažké, zvlášť budúcnosť, ako sa hovorí.
It is really difficult to predict the future, but some things can be said. Primarily, it is really important what has been going on during and after the Maidan, and also in terms of Russian aggression in the eastern part of Ukraine. In the words of Alexander Duleba, who understands the Ukrainian situation, Putin made a mistake because he got Crimea, but he lost Ukraine. This reinforced the Ukrainian nation, and there is no longer the alternative of being friends with the Russian regime. It is impossible to stop making reforms and to turn to friendship with Russia. The only option for Ukraine is to become a part of Europe now. Regardless of who is in the government, Ukraine is going to need funding. In the presidential election and the next parliamentary election, no matter who wins, funding will be needed. So even if populists win, no matter how terrible it would be, they will have no other option because Russia will no longer be an alternative.
Bez ohľadu na to, aká vláda príde, bude životne potrebovať
Maybe
podporu
theoretically,
medzinárodného menového
China might
fondu,
help,
vlastne nebude
but
vedieť
even
požičať
populists
z
would
bankrotuje.
still have to turn to Europe.
Ak by aj
So
prišli
there are
peniaze,
more
že by bolo
options.
zlé, tak nebudú mať veľmi inú možnosť, keďže s Ruskom sa už nedá.
Firstly, there could be a government which will be worse than the current one. It could be populists who will conduct reforms slower, but more or less the same direction will be followed.
Vláda, ktorá je horšia ako dnešná, viac populistická, ale aj tá bude prinútená vlastne ísť týmto smerom, čiže sa pôjde...
The other option is that there will be a similar government or even a better one which will make many reforms and which will be supported by the government.
Reformnejšia vláda, ktorá aj s podporou v parlamente.
It is not impossible, but if you look at the current polls, it does not seem likely.
Na dnešné prieskumy verejnej mienky, tak sa to nezdá, že by sa to mohlo stať.
Anyway, there will be a big demand for new faces. About 60% of people do not trust anyone. And if there is someone like the Ukrainian version of Macron, and if this personality is supported by pro-reform forces, this could really help Ukraine.
A že by sa teda tie proreformné sily vedeli pridať, tie, ktoré sú, tak to vylúčené nie je.
Tak uvidíme, ako to na Ukrajine dopadne.
The last question would be about your countries.
Vašich pôvodných krajín, hoci Ivan už to hovorí, že my tu máme voľby za rok.
Ivan mentioned the forthcoming election here.
Tak,
What is the current situation in Hungary?
dnešný stav Maďarska...
And where is it going, Lajos?
Lajos.
Jelenleg Magyarországon harmadik ciklusát éli az önkényuralmi rendszer.
In Hungary, the authoritarian regime has just entered its third term.
Amit részben annak köszönhet, hogy
They have two-thirds majority in parliament again, partly owing to the fact that they have destroyed the freedom of press.
nem volt egyenlő feltételekkel megvalósítható.
There was no equal conditions to run the campaign.
Nem volt lehetőség arra,
It wasn't possible for the opposition parties to use government media and resources.
az állami médiát, és ilyen körülmények
And these circumstances, the hate campaign against immigrants and refugees was launched. Also, Viktor Orban used to threaten Hungarian society, saying that if refugees come, you will lose your social benefits.
fenyegette meg a magyar társadalmat, hogy ha jönnek a menekültek, akkor nektek nem lesz családi pótlék.
This is a very sorrowful situation, because this is a dead end.
Ez egy nagyon-nagyon szomorú és sajnálatos helyzet, mert
There is no way out of it for the current government, because our international relations have been dismantled.
ennek a jelenlegi kormánynak, hiszen a nemzetközi kapcsolatokat szétrombolta,
Practically, our international prestige is at an all-time low.
rendkívül
They are
alacsony,
basically fighting a constant war of independence against the EU.
szabadságharcot folytat az Európai Unió ellen, miközben 2 hét alatt megbukna,
Whereas they would fail in 2 weeks, they didn't receive such extensive funding from the taxpayers of the declining West.
a magyar társadalom valószínűleg előbb-utóbb kiábrándul.
The Hungarian society will probably become disillusioned sooner or later,
Remélhető,
and hopefully the change will be peaceful, because it is clear that if we want to achieve economic growth, our own and with our own resources, then good results can only be achieved through competitiveness.
erőre akarjuk alapozni, akkor csak a versenyképesség, a külföldi tőke behozatala,
The influx of foreign capital, increasing productivity, and no repression or intervention into the economy by the government.
és a kormány gazdaságba való beavatkozásának a
So,
visszaszorítása
in Hungary, once again,
hozhat eredményt.
we have to speak about how the government should respect private property, how the government should protect and not violate contracts and agreements.
Tulajdont. A kormánynak védeni kellene Nem lábbal tiporni a szerződéseket.
How the state should encourage privatization instead of nationalization.
Nem olyan adókat bevezetni, amivel
They shouldn't introduce taxes distorting the structure of the economy and which favour friends who are making the least effort to do efficient work in Hungary and to invest in Hungary.
akik a legkevésbé sem igyekeznek Magyarországon hatékony munkát végezni és befektetni.
So this oligarchical economic structure does hold Ukraine, Russia and other post-communist countries captive for decades. This oligarchy has been accomplished in Hungary in the third decade after the regime
Ez
change.
most Magyarországon a rendszerváltás harmadik évtizedében megvalósult.
This is a complete dead end. And once again, this can only be maintained with funding from the European Union, which is bound to decrease drastically from 2020.
Amelyik nyilván 2020 után jóval kevesebb lesz.
What we get to hear about Hungary is not very promising. On the other hand, Slovakia does not seem very hopeful. If you look at the government and what they say and do, if you consider that a Slovak journalist and his girlfriend were murdered recently, can you tell us what is going on in Slovakia?
No, najskôr k tej tvojej poznámke, že som povedal, že my tu máme voľby, áno, my tu máme voľby.
Firstly, about the forthcoming election, I would like to say that although I'm in Ukraine most of the time, my heart is still in Slovakia, obviously. I did not want to lose the Slovak citizenship, which would happen if I accepted the Ukrainian one. For this reason, I could not become the Minister of Economy here. If we look at the prospects for Slovakia, it seems better compared to Hungary. Lajos described it very precisely. The situation is not good, but we can see threats everywhere. In Poland, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So this is a more global issue. And I think that, on the one hand, there are signals which are not good. For example, the number of people who are influenced and manipulated by anti-migrant hysteria and other forms of populism.
Doslova manipulovaní tou anti-imigračnou hystériou a inými.
On the other hand, what happened after the murder of Jan Kuciak in February and March filled me with certain optimism as people showed they still care about where the country is going. There were many of them, and also it was the fact that many of them are young and educated. These people want Slovakia to be a country that respects justice. I think it is important for people to mobilize if they feel that freedom and liberal democracy are in danger. As Lajos said, there is no bread without freedom in the end. People need to mobilize and fight. It is very dangerous when we perceive these things as something that exists automatically and take them for granted. Freedom can be in danger, and this also applies to developed countries. Nevertheless, as I said, there is this hope that things will not be so bad. It will require a lot of effort, though. And new generations of leaders and politicians will have to work on this. The economy, the bread, is always important. But without freedom, free competition, and fairness, there can be no prosperity. So, sooner or later, it will show that corrupted state capitalism cannot compete with countries that are truly free. It shouldn't be taken for granted, and we need to keep striving for it. Thank you very much for joining us at the Maidan.
Ďakujem.